Have you ever stood in a room full of people and still felt completely unseen? Have you ever watched someone you love get misjudged, not because of what they've done, but because of what they look like? This is the story of a quiet man in a thrifted blazer and the daughter who finally saw him the way the world should have all along. At first glance, it's a story about a graduation. But stay with us because what unfolded that day in the university auditorium would crack open years of silence, upend generations of judgment, and reveal a hidden act of heroism the world had forgotten. By the end of this story, you may find yourself questioning what truly makes a man worthy of respect and what it means to love without ever asking to be recognized. It began on a breezy June afternoon inside the ornate reception hall of Langford University. The marble floors gleamed, polished to perfection. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, casting elegant shadows over rows of proud families. Laughter danced in corners of the room, champagne flutes chimed, photographs were taken, hugs exchanged. And yet for Emily Bennett this day, the day she received her college diploma, carried a tension she couldn't shake. She walked slowly, her black heels tapping gently against the floor. Beside her walked James Bennett, her stepfather. He wore a navy blazer, just a shade too faded khaki slacks, and a tie she'd helped him pick that morning. It sat a little crooked, and he hadn't noticed. He was a quiet man, in his late 40s, brown-skinned, soft-eyed, the kind of person you might overlook in a crowd if you weren't looking closely. But Emily saw him. Every day of her childhood, she'd seen him. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, but he had shown up for her over and over in ways that mattered more than most would ever understand. She adjusted the gold tassel on her cap. Her eyes scanned the room, but her chest already felt tight. She didn't need to see them to know they were near. Her mother's family, the Whitmores, were stationed as always like a display pearls posture, perfect smiles. They stood near the refreshment table, sipping sparkling cider and trading glances, holding their cups like props in a stage play. And as Emily approached, the air shifted. So did the tone. "Is that the driver she brought, I heard? He's just her stepfather. Married into the family. She could have brought someone respectable." Emily's stomach clenched. She glanced at James. He was still looking ahead, expression steady. As if none of it reached him. As if those words slipped off his skin like water. But Emily knew better. She saw the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly, the way his fingers fidgeted inside his pockets. Her mother hadn't come. Another year, another excuse. But James had driven 7 hours straight through the night without complaint just to be here, just to stand beside her, and still, he was treated like the help. Emily took a breath and gently placed a hand on his elbow, not to pull him away from the judgment, but to remind them both he belonged right there. They moved toward a professor she recognized, and Emily forced a smile. She didn't speak about the stairs. She didn't need to. Because this story, their story, wasn't about noise. It never had been. It was about presence and patience and the kind of love that doesn't announce itself but never fails to show up. And just when the day seemed to be settling into another quiet injustice, the university called a name no one expected, a name that would change everything. James Bennett, the man they thought was nobody, but who turned out to be the kind of somebody that rewrites legacies not with fanfare, but with quiet courage. So stay with us. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story of recognition, it's a story of redefinition. A story for anyone who's ever been overlooked, or loved someone who deserved more than the world ever gave them. This one's for you. There's something oddly theatrical about graduation day. The robes, the music, the rows of families dressed in their best. It's as if the whole event is staged not just for the students, but for the audience watching them step into adulthood. Every hug, every cheer, every photo becomes a performance of pride. But for Emily Bennett, the applause that echoed through the grand hall that day felt strangely hollow. Not because she wasn't proud, she was. Not because she hadn't worked hard, she had. But because as she looked around, she realized not all pride is treated equally. The reception hall gleamed like a page out of a university brochure. Marble floors stretched beneath high ceilings. Elegant banners fluttered overhead. Parents snapped pictures on the steps, beaming beside children in caps and gowns. Faculty members milled about congratulating students with polished phrases. Emily stood near the center aisle, Her cap carefully adjusted her diploma tucked under one arm. And beside her, standing quietly, slightly off-center, just enough to be overlooked, was James Bennett, her stepfather. He didn't dress like the other parents. No custom-tailored suit, no polished cufflinks or expensive watch. His blazer had been worn to multiple church Sundays and school conferences. His shoes were clean but creased. His tie, the one Emily had chosen from a discount rack the week before, was just a shade too wide. Still, he stood tall. There was no bravado in him, no need to be noticed. But Emily noticed everything. She noticed how he lingered behind her, giving her the space to shine. She noticed how he smiled when she looked at him soft, without expectation. And she noticed with painful clarity how others didn't see him at all. Or worse, they did see him and decided he didn't belong. A woman with a pearl necklace and flawless lipstick glanced over, then whispered something behind her hand. A man nearby nodded, chuckled, sipped his drink. Emily caught bits of it, words like groundskeeper, staff, guest, not real family. She'd heard it before. Not always said outright. Sometimes it came in looks. Sometimes in the way people addressed her and not him, or the way they assumed he wasn't important enough to be introduced. That day it hit harder, because this was supposed to be the moment she shared with him, the man who showed up when her biological father walked out, who never missed a school event, who worked double shifts just to help with tuition books, who knew the name of every teacher she'd ever had. And yet all they saw was his blazer, his skin, his silence. They didn't see his sacrifice. It reminded her of a story James once told her about when he was a boy, and how his grandfather used to wear overalls to church because he couldn't afford a suit. People would step aside when he walked in, not out of respect but discomfort. Folks like him didn't fit the pew, they used to whisper, and now decades later it was happening again. Just in different clothes. It's strange, Emily thought, how appearances can speak louder than applause. She realized something in that moment, a lesson so many people miss in the rush to present themselves. Respectability isn't about the shine on your shoes. It's about the strength in your walk. And James had always walked with quiet strength. As the ceremony drew closer, Emily could feel the weight of the whispers building, the performance of perfection all around them, the curated families, the practiced smiles. But she didn't let go of his arm. She didn't step ahead. Instead, she squeezed gently, not out of obligation, but recognition. And James, as always, simply nodded. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. Because sometimes the most powerful connection between two people doesn't require words. It's felt steady grounding, like a hand resting quietly on your shoulder just when you need it most. And in that stillness, surrounded by polished marble and polished manners, Emily decided something: she wouldn't let the judgments define their day. Not when she knew the truth of who stood beside her. Because what they had, the realness of it, could never be measured by status or silenced by stares. It could only be seen by someone willing to truly look. And with that truth anchoring her heart, Emily turned toward the auditorium, unaware that the day ahead would unravel everything she thought she knew. Because just when appearances seemed to hold all the power, one name would be called that no one expected. And the story, quietly waiting in the wings, was finally ready to step into the light. There are rooms so pristine, so perfectly curated, that they don't welcome you, they warn you. The kind of rooms where every glass shines like it's never been touched. Every laugh is a little too practiced, and every word is polished, sharp enough to cut, even when spoken with a smile. That was the room Emily Bennett walked into that day. And those were the whispers that followed her in. The Whitmores, her mother's family, were already assembled in formation by the refreshment table. Picture perfect, dressed in pale linens and soft cashmere, as if they had stepped out of a magazine spread titled Legacy and Elegance. They stood tall, postures, flawless, laughter light and hollow. Each movement rehearsed, each glance calculated. Every one of them held a glass of sparkling cider, not like a drink, but like a prop in a performance they had mastered. To a stranger, they looked like the ideal family. Accomplished, cultured, refined. But Emily knew better. She had grown up watching how they spoke through silence, how they judged through questions that weren't really questions. "Oh, is that your stepfather? He drove you here. Oh, I thought your mother might come." "No." "Well, how unfortunate." Their tone always floated just above condescension, soft enough to deny intention if confronted, but clear enough to land like a stone in the stomach. They never said James didn't belong. They didn't have to. It was in the way Aunt Margaret shifted her purse to the far side of her chair when he passed. It was in the way Cousin Henry, a junior investment banker, narrowed his eyes like James was someone who might ask to park his car. It was in the way no one asked his name. No one asked what he did. No one asked how far he'd driven to be there. They simply assumed and ignored. The Whitmores didn't dislike James because of anything he did. They dismissed him because of everything he wasn't: not wealthy, not connected, not white, not from their circle. And that dismissal wasn't loud. It was whispered, wrapped in etiquette, disguised as indifference. Emily had learned early that her mother's family didn't raise voices, they raised eyebrows. And James, he had endured it for years, never retaliating, never shrinking. There was one Thanksgiving when she was 16. She remembered it clearly. James had offered to carve the turkey. He was good at it, steady hands from years of engine work. But Uncle Patrick had smiled and said, "Let the men handle it," and reached for the knife. No one laughed, except Emily, because in that moment she realized Uncle Patrick didn't see James as a man at all. He saw a mechanic, a placeholder, someone her mother had settled for. That day James had quietly stepped back, picked up a stack of plates, and helped in the kitchen instead. No protest, no wounded pride. But Emily had noticed. And once you notice injustice, once it touches someone you love, you never stop seeing it. So here she was, years later, watching it happen again. Only this time she didn't want to laugh. She wanted to rage, but she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she stayed near him. And she listened. Because the most dangerous thing about judgment whispered in rooms like these is that it doesn't shout. It doesn't confront you where you can fight it. It gaslights you into questioning whether you imagined it at all. And that's what makes it so powerful. It's what lets people like the Whitmores move through the world untouched, always just polite enough to escape accountability. But Emily had learned something growing up with James. What people whisper about others often says more about their own fears than anyone else's worth. And James, he wasn't afraid of being misjudged. He was only afraid that Emily might start believing it. That's why he always kept his hands in his pockets, why he stood a little off to the side, why he never asked for a seat at the table. He didn't want to make waves, he just wanted to make sure she had every chance to stand tall. And even now, surrounded by glass walls and thin smiles, James stood steady. Because his pride wasn't fragile. It was forged. But the day hadn't even begun to unfold. And while the Whitmores were busy composing whispers and polishing their disdain, the university was preparing to drop a name that would rattle the crystal. And this time, the whisper would not be theirs. It would be history's, and it would echo. Love doesn't always arrive with grand entrances or poetic vows. Sometimes it just stays, quietly, consistently, even when no one claps for it. That's how James Bennett entered Emily's life. Not as a hero, not as a replacement, just as a man who refused to walk away. She was 10 the first time he picked her up from school. Her backpack was too big, her sneakers too tight, and her heart too heavy. Her real father had left just days earlier, a suitcase, a vague excuse about needing space, and a promise to call. He never did. But James did something different. He showed up. That day he pulled up in a rust-colored pickup that groaned when the passenger door opened. The other parents drove shiny cars and wore pressed blazers. James had oil on his sleeves and work dust on his boots. He leaned across the seat and smiled at her, like he'd been waiting his whole life to see her. And when she climbed in silent and embarrassed, he didn't ask questions. He just handed her a cup of hot chocolate and said, "Tough day." She didn't speak. She didn't need to. He already understood. That became their rhythm. No dramatics, no big declarations, just presence. He was there for every school play, even the one where she forgot her lines. He was there for every science project, crouched on the floor late at night with tangled wires and glue guns, treating a fourth-grade volcano like it was a NASA prototype. When Emily got the flu and missed a week of school, he spent his evenings reteaching her the lessons she'd missed, even when he had to Google how fractions worked. When she stayed up until 2 a.m., stressing over her college essay, he stayed up too. Didn't say much. Just sat nearby with a bowl of popcorn and read the newspaper. She'd glance up now and then, and he'd just nod like saying, I'm here. Keep going. He never pushed, never pried, just kept showing up. There was a time when Emily, still angry and confused about her father's absence, lashed out. She slammed a door, screamed that James wasn't her real dad, and burst into tears on the stairs. James didn't get mad. He didn't raise his voice. He just sat beside her, hands resting on his knees, and said, I'm not trying to replace anyone. I'm just trying to be someone who stays. And he did. Through violin recitals where she hit every wrong note, through braces, breakouts, broken hearts, through the awkward teenage years and the messy ones that came after. James Bennett stayed, not because anyone asked him to, but because he knew that love, real love, isn't about taking credit. It's about taking root. And that's what he had done in Emily's life. He became the kind of father who didn't demand the title, he earned it. He didn't post about their moments. He didn't expect praise from her mother's family. He didn't even insist on being called dad. He just poured himself into the quiet spaces most people overlook. He fixed what was broken. He showed up when it mattered. And he listened, really listened, when no one else knew how. The world doesn't often celebrate that kind of love. It's not the stuff of viral proposals or award speeches, but it's the kind of love that builds futures, that makes healing possible, that raises a girl into a woman who stands tall in rooms where others try to shrink her. That morning, as they stood side by side in the graduation hall, Emily's mind flickered through all those moments, the invisible sacrifices, the soft-spoken strength. She looked at James standing a few feet behind her in his weathered suit and felt the weight of a decade's worth of unspoken gratitude rising in her chest. She wanted to say something, anything, but he simply smiled. That smile, the same one from the pickup truck all those years ago. And just like that, her heart quieted. Because in that small exchange, she knew he never needed to be thanked. He just needed her to know he was always going to stay. Still, neither of them could have predicted what would happen next. Because while Emily was quietly reliving the past, the university was preparing to honor a past that James had never spoken of. A past that would soon turn whispers into awe and silence into standing ovation. Sometimes the people who give us life aren't the ones who teach us how to live. Emily had stopped expecting much from her mother years ago. Birthdays were usually marked with short texts. Holidays meant a box in the mail, late, generic, impersonal. And now, on the most important day of her academic life, her mother wasn't there. It's just too far this time, honey, her mother had said over the phone, voice flat, as if 2 hours on a plane were an impossible journey. I have a conference. I sent you something, though. Click. The something was a silk scarf Emily would never wear, wrapped around a card that read, proud of you, love, Mom. But no voice message, no video call, no follow-up. And yet across the country, James had driven through the night without sleep just to be there when Emily crossed the stage. It wasn't the distance, it wasn't the money, it wasn't the schedule. It was something deeper, something quieter. A refusal, perhaps, to acknowledge what she hadn't built and what someone else had. Because while James was growing into the role of dad, her mother never fully accepted it. There had always been a polite, bitter edge to her tone when James came up in conversation. He means well. He tries. He's not your father, though. And Emily had learned painfully that love was something her mother measured in conditions. James, on the other hand, gave it unconditionally. She remembered one conversation in particular a few weeks before graduation. They were on the phone. Emily had asked gently if her mother planned to attend the ceremony. There was a pause. Then, is he going to be there? It wasn't even a question, really, more like a warning. Emily didn't respond right away. Then softly she said, yes, of course he is. Another pause. Well, I just don't want to feel out of place. Out of place. That was the phrase. As if the woman who left her daughter to be raised by someone else by choice was somehow the one being alienated. Emily felt the quiet ache of that moment settle inside her like a stone. But she didn't argue. She no longer needed to, because that conversation wasn't about her anymore. It was about her mother's reflection and what she couldn't bring herself to face. James didn't steal a role. He filled a void. He didn't try to take credit. He simply picked up the pieces someone else had dropped and never looked back for praise. And maybe that's what made it hard for her mother to show up. Not the flight, not the distance, but the mirror James held up without ever saying a word. Because he didn't just raise Emily. He revealed through kindness and consistency what should have been. And sometimes that's harder to face than absence. Love, when it comes from unexpected places, exposes what's missing in the places we expected it most. It's a quiet truth, one that doesn't sting right away, but lingers. Still, Emily had made peace with it, not because it didn't hurt, but because she had stopped chasing love that needed convincing. Instead, she stood in the presence of love that had never needed permission to show up. And on that graduation day, with her mother's absence echoing loudly across the marble floor, it was James who stood beside her. James who brought snacks in the car. James who ironed his slacks with shaky hands. James who asked if his tie looked all right. And it was James who would later be called to the stage, not for a role he claimed, but for a life he lived in full. Emily didn't know that yet, but she could feel it. A quiet shift in the room, a gentle tension in the air, like a curtain waiting to be drawn back. Because while pain had been passed down, love had taken root elsewhere. And what was about to unfold just moments away would change the way everyone in that room understood what it really meant to be a parent. Sometimes it doesn't take a scream to break someone. Just a sentence, said softly, said carelessly, said loud enough to be heard, but quiet enough to be denied. Emily was reaching for a dessert plate when she heard it. I wonder what her real father would think. The voice was unmistakable, sharp, and sugar-coated, like something served on fine china with a bitter aftertaste. She froze mid-reach. Her fingers curled just slightly around the plate, enough to make the ceramic creak. Her breath caught before it could reach her chest. Time didn't stop exactly, but something inside her did. It wasn't the words themselves. She had heard worse. It was the timing, the intimacy of the moment, the way they pierced her when her guard was just low enough to feel it. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She knew the tone, knew it belonged to someone on her mother's side, perhaps a cousin or a friend of the family, someone who smiled with closed lips and always seemed to know just how far they could push without crossing the line. Except this time, they crossed it. She felt her shoulders tense, her back stiffen. Years of trying to stay composed in rooms like this all threatened to unravel in a single instant. And then she felt it. A hand. James's hand. Gently it reached across the table, his fingertips brushing hers. The same calloused hands that had once held her bike steady, packed her lunch, picked her up off the driveway after a fall. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't need to. It was his presence, steady warm like a lighthouse when the waves hit too hard. And just like that, the moment cracked, but didn't collapse. Emily blinked, swallowed the ache in her throat. Her eyes shimmered, but she wouldn't let them spill. Not here, not now. The comment lingered behind her like smoke from a blown-out candle, but she didn't let it burn. Because in that moment, as the memory of her biological father tried to cast a shadow, the truth stood beside her, solid, real, undeniable. James Bennett wasn't the man who shared her blood. He was the man who shared her life. He was the one who stayed up with her during fevered nights, who rewired the basement light after it short-circuited, who sat through her violin recitals, every off-key squeaky note, and still clapped like it was Carnegie Hall. She didn't need to defend that to anyone. But still, that one comment, it hurt because it echoed a fear she had buried deep, that maybe some people would never see him as enough. No matter what he'd done, no matter how much he'd loved. That's the power of words spoken from ignorance. They don't just challenge facts. They challenge identity. They make you question whether what you've built, what you've survived, will ever be enough to overwrite what others believe should have been. But that's also where quiet courage begins. In the moment you choose not to let someone else's definition rewrite your truth. Emily turned toward James, her hand finding his underneath the table now. And in that small touch, she reminded herself, you don't owe people an explanation for who you call family. Because family isn't proven in DNA. It's proven in moments, in mornings made easier, in dinners not eaten alone, in patience that asked for nothing in return. Still, something had shifted. The room didn't feel the same anymore. The air was heavier, thicker, filled not with warmth, but with a silent tension that stretched across the hall like an unseen thread. Emily adjusted her cap, forced a small breath back into her lungs, and told herself to stay focused. The ceremony was about to begin. And no one, not even the ones who whispered behind programs and polished pearls, knew what was coming next. Because the next name to echo across that auditorium would belong to someone they had spent the whole morning ignoring. There's a particular kind of strength that never steps into the spotlight. It doesn't raise its voice, doesn't demand applause. It simply stays even when staying means standing alone. James Bennett knew that kind of strength well. He was standing near the back wall of the auditorium now, hands clasped gently in front of him. His posture was relaxed but not casual, quiet but not unsure. He didn't fidget, didn't shuffle his feet. He just stood solid and still like a steady beam in a house full of moving parts. His suit was pressed, but it was old, slightly too big in the shoulders, the cuffs a little frayed. His shoes, though polished that morning, still bore the scuff marks of years of real work. Not the kind done in offices or boardrooms, but in garages and beneath car hoods. To the Whitmores seated in perfect rows up front, James might as well have been invisible. And that was the irony. The man they saw as background was in truth the foundation. Emily sat near the front, close enough to the stage to hear the shuffle of papers, the buzz of microphones. But her mind wasn't on the speeches. It was on the man behind her. On the way, her family's eyes kept flicking back at him, not with curiosity, but with calculation. On the way, her cousin leaned over and whispered with a barely contained laugh, "Maybe he's here to clean up after." And someone else added, "Seriously, who shows up to graduation dressed like the maintenance crew?" Emily heard it. Every word, and she said nothing. Not because it didn't hurt, but because she didn't trust herself to speak without shaking. She glanced back subtly, quietly, just enough to see James. He hadn't reacted. Not with a glance, not with a flinch, but she could tell the way she always could that he'd heard it too. He always did. James had a way of absorbing pain without showing the bruise. It wasn't that he didn't feel it. He just never let it own him. That was his quiet defiance. He'd spent his life in spaces where people assumed his silence meant he had nothing to say, where his humility was mistaken for smallness, where his gentleness was interpreted as absence. But Emily knew better. She'd seen him take her to every parent-teacher conference, even when the teachers expected someone else. She'd seen him build her a bookshelf from scraps because she once said she wanted a place for words. She'd seen him sit through orchestral recitals in the back row alone, clapping longer than anyone else. And now she saw him here in a room full of people who'd rather pretend he wasn't real, standing taller than any of them dared to. Because when you know who you are, you don't need the world to tell you. That's the thing about true character. It doesn't rush to defend itself. It doesn't seek revenge on small-minded whispers. It simply waits, knowing that truth always finds a way to rise. Emily folded her program and set it gently on her lap. The room was growing quieter. The chancellor was making her way to the podium. Faculty began to shift in their seats. Photographers stepped into place. The murmur of conversation slowed to a hush. Emily's heartbeat quickened. Something was coming. She could feel it. Like the stillness right before a storm, not the kind that destroys, but the kind that reveals. Because what no one knew, not the guests, not the Whitmores, not even James himself, was that the stage they were all staring at was about to become his. Sometimes truth doesn't knock. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait for the perfect moment. It just walks in unexpected and undeniable, like sunlight breaking through a heavy curtain. That's how it felt when the chancellor's voice echoed through the grand auditorium. "There is one award today," she said, pausing as if to measure the weight of her next words that we did not announce in advance. Emily sat up straighter. Around her, the audience leaned in eyes-curious programs, rustling quietly. Even the Whitmores, until now locked in their own silent commentary, seemed momentarily interested. "This is a special recognition," the chancellor continued, "for extraordinary personal sacrifice, for leadership in moments of danger, and for a life lived in quiet service to others." Emily's breath caught. It couldn't be. No, that wasn't possible. Was it? Her eyes flicked instinctively toward James, still standing at the back, still unnoticed by most. But something in his expression had changed. He was listening now, not just politely, but intently, as if a memory had stirred that he hadn't allowed himself to visit in years. The chancellor took a breath. 12 years ago, she began during the early hours of rush hour. A bomb detonated on the lower tracks of the 7th Street subway station. The room fell completely silent. There was chaos, smoke, screams. People ran for the exits. Many were injured, some were trapped. And in the midst of it, one man ran toward the wreckage. Emily's heart was pounding now. A man, a rescue. She suddenly remembered not just the story, but the headlines. Subway Samaritan saves lives, then vanishes. It had circulated for weeks back then. News anchors tried to find the man. Eyewitnesses described him as calm, focused, fast-moving. But no name had ever surfaced. He pulled 8 passengers from the wreckage. The chancellor continued, her voice growing softer now. He used his own shirt to stop bleeding. He administered CPR to a child. And when first responders arrived, he was gone. A quiet gasp floated from somewhere in the back row. One woman whispered, "I remember that story." Emily blinked hard, struggling to reconcile what she was hearing with the man she knew. Could it really be? The chancellor glanced at her notes, then back out at the crowd. He never sought recognition, never gave his name. But years later, through a series of anonymous donations made to the trauma center that treated those victims, we found a pattern, and eventually we found a name. Emily didn't breathe. The entire room was suspended in that single held moment, like the last second before a curtain lifts. And then the name came. Soft, steady, measured, James Bennett. At first, no one moved. Then slowly, heads began to turn. Back, toward the man in the oversized suit. The man near the exit. The man they'd all assumed was someone's +1 or someone on staff. Emily's eyes filled instantly. She turned to face him fully, her hands shaking in her lap. And James, he stood frozen, not in pride, in disbelief. His eyebrows lifted slightly. His mouth parted just enough to draw breath. It was the look of a man who had lived his whole life beneath the radar, only to suddenly be seen in the most unexpected, undeniable way. A beat passed, and then the applause began. Slow at first, polite, unsure, then louder. Row by row, people stood. Not everyone. The Whitmores remained seated, still processing, still too stunned to clap. But the rest of the room rose. Strangers, faculty, students, all of them on their feet for the man who had once slipped out of a subway station unnoticed. Emily stood too, taller than before, stronger, as if her own bones were echoing the truth she had always known. He wasn't just the man who raised her. He was the man who had saved others, who had run toward danger when most people would run away. And still, never spoke of it. That's the thing about quiet heroes. They don't need the story told. But when it is told, everything changes. The chancellor stepped back from the podium. "Mr. Bennett," she said warmly, "would you join us on stage?" All eyes turned. And slowly, humbly, James took his first step forward. Not rushed, not grand, just steady like he always was. Because this wasn't just a man walking toward recognition. This was a moment years in the making, finally walking toward truth. And as he approached the stairs leading up to the podium, Emily's eyes stayed locked on his. What she didn't know yet, what the whole room didn't know, was that the speech he was about to give would be the kind of speech that doesn't just honor the past, it rewrites it. The room was still, not silent, but reverent. The kind of stillness reserved for sacred things. James Bennett stood center stage now, the spotlight gently finding its way to his shoulders. In his hands, a glass plaque shimmered with etched letters, his name finally carved in recognition. But his eyes, and they were searching. Not for applause, not for approval. For her, Emily, she was easy to find. Front row, hands trembling, heart bursting. The girl he once picked up from school in a rust-stained truck. Now a woman standing beneath banners of honor, watching him be honored. He stepped up to the microphone, adjusted it with fingers that bore the quiet evidence of years' small scars, firm calluses, and a steadiness that came not from confidence, but from conviction. He cleared his throat softly. "I wasn't expecting this," he began, voice gentle but clear. "Honestly, I never expected anything at all." A chuckle rippled faintly through the crowd, but he didn't pause to let it grow. "I didn't do any of it for recognition. Not that day on the subway, not the days after. I saw people in trouble. I moved. That's it. He paused, eyes lifting slightly toward the audience. And truth is, if there's one thing I'm more proud of than that day, it's this day. Being here. Watching someone I love step into her future. He looked down for a moment, then back up right toward Emily. My stepdaughter, he said, the word slow and deliberate, is the most brilliant person I know. Emily felt her breath hitch. She gets back up every time life tries to knock her down. And believe me, life tried. More than once. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried the memory of scraped knees and slammed doors, and college rejection letters turned into scholarships. I'm not her biological father, he said, his voice unwavering now. But when her dad walked away, I knew that little girl needed someone who would stay. Another pause. Longer this time. I didn't know how to be a dad, he admitted. I didn't have a guidebook. I didn't know which words to say or what birthdays called for what gifts. I just knew that every morning, she needed someone at the breakfast table. So I sat down. A few sniffles sounded softly across the room. I showed up for violin recitals. I fixed busted nightlights. I learned how to spell mitochondria because she needed help on a science quiz. Laughter now quiet, warm, real. I never expected anyone to call me dad. I never asked her to, because for me, it was never about the title. It was about the choice. He took a breath, letting the words settle. Anyone can father a child, but being a father, that's something you have to wake up and decide to be every single day. Emily's eyes were full now, but she didn't wipe the tears. She let them fall, because each one held a memory of car rides and birthday cakes, of apologies that didn't need words, of showing up again and again. James glanced down at the plaque in his hand. I didn't think people noticed, he said quietly. I didn't think it mattered. Then looking up, voice firm but soft. But maybe it does. He stepped back from the mic with a nod. Not dramatic, not showy, just a quiet gesture of thanks. And that was all it took. The room erupted. Not with noise, but with meaning. Applause rang out, not polite, not obligatory, but earned. The kind that builds like thunder, not because it's loud, but because it's right. Even the Whitmores, stiff in their seats, couldn't quite avoid clapping now. And Emily. She rose before the rest. Not because it was expected, but because it was personal. Because the man who had spent a lifetime standing just behind her had finally been seen. And in that moment, for the first time, everyone else saw what she had always known, that a real father doesn't need to share your blood. He just needs to choose you and keep choosing you, even when no one's looking. As James stepped down from the stage, the light followed him. But so did the weight of years. Years spent quietly, faithfully in the background. Now, he walked into the light, and beside it, the next chapter was waiting to unfold. Because while the room had just witnessed a speech, Emily was about to witness a shift. Not just in perception, but in legacy. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. It doesn't arrive in a courtroom or come with a headline. Sometimes it just stands there, wearing an old suit, holding a plaque, and undoing years of quiet cruelty without ever raising its voice. As James stepped down from the stage, the applause still echoing, something else began to shift in the auditorium. Not in sound, but in posture, in faces, in eyes. Emily watched it happen. It began with the woman in the second row, the one who had earlier leaned toward her neighbor and whispered something about maintenance crew. Now that same woman was dabbing the corner of her eye with a tissue, her expression tangled between embarrassment and admiration. A few seats down, Aunt Margaret, always the first to judge and the last to listen, sat stiff, her spine like steel. But even she couldn't quite mask the way her gaze had dropped, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her program. Then came the first approach. Uncle Lawrence, her mother's brother, a man who had once suggested, not so subtly, that James was probably a good guy, just not really your level. He stepped forward slow and unsure, as if wading into unfamiliar waters. Well, he said, clearing his throat. That was something. James smiled politely. Yes, sir. Lawrence shifted on his feet, eyes briefly scanning the floor. I suppose I owe you. He paused. I didn't know. James didn't blink. You didn't ask. The words weren't sharp. They weren't defensive. They were honest. And that was enough to stop Lawrence mid-sentence. He nodded awkwardly and stepped back. Another moment passed. Then another cousin approached, the same one who had joked earlier about James probably here to clean up. Now he stood with his hands behind his back, avoiding eye contact. "I didn't mean anything by it," he mumbled. James didn't answer right away. Then with gentle steadiness, he replied, "That's often the problem. It wasn't bitter. It was simple. And it landed harder than any lecture could have. Because what James understood, what Emily had come to understand, was that most prejudice doesn't start in hatred. It starts in assumption. Assumption that some people don't belong, that some people are less, that kindness can be casual, but respect has to be earned, and only by certain types of people. But that day, those assumptions began to crack. Not because James argued, not because Emily shouted, but because truth had taken center stage and no one could unsee it. The man they had dismissed had saved lives, had raised a daughter without needing the spotlight, had stood in their presence not with pride but with patience. And now he stood surrounded by the very people who had once questioned his presence, who now couldn't find the words to undo what they'd thought or said. Emily stood beside him through it all. She didn't gloat. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't need to. Because dignity doesn't dance on someone else's shame. It simply stands a little taller when the moment arrives. And in that stillness, somewhere between apology and awe, Emily felt a quiet truth settle in her chest. Sometimes the most powerful form of justice is simply being seen. And James was finally seen. Not just as a man who meant well, not as Mom's second husband, not as the guy who helped raise her. He was seen as a hero, a father, a man whose presence could no longer be reduced to whispers in a corner or assumptions in a glance. They left the hall together, arm in arm, past the people who once looked through him, past the judgment that had once followed every step, past the silence that had for too long swallowed his worth. But James didn't walk with bitterness. He walked with grace, because some victories aren't about proving others wrong. They're about finally living in a world that sees what you've always known to be true. And as they stepped out into the soft afternoon light, neither of them realized that the most personal moment of all was still waiting in the quiet kitchen of a home built not from wealth, but from love. The drive home that evening was quiet, not the kind of silence that fills space awkwardly, but the kind that follows something sacred, like the hush after a great piece of music when no one wants to be the first to speak and break the stillness. Emily leaned her head gently against the car window, watching the sun dip low behind quiet neighborhoods. James drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting softly on his thigh. His posture relaxed, his eyes calm. No one said the words "today" changed everything. They didn't need to, because some transformations don't come with fireworks. They come with peace. When they pulled into the driveway of their modest home, the sky had turned gold. The porch light flickered on automatically. A few kids rode bikes down the sidewalk. A dog barked in the distance. It was just life. Ordinary, unremarkable, perfect. Inside, the air smelled faintly of flowers. The bouquet Emily had been given at the ceremony was still sitting on the kitchen table, petals gently wilting, but fragrant nonetheless. On the counter, a half-eaten chocolate cake sat beside two plates, James's tradition for any win worth remembering, whether it was passing a test or fixing the water heater. Emily walked to the fridge without a word. In her hands, she held two things. The first, a framed drawing from third grade, a crayon house with crooked windows and lopsided clouds. In the middle stood a tall stick figure, labeled in all caps, "My Hero James." It had lived on the fridge for years, its edges curled with time, the tape yellowing. The second, a photo from that morning, freshly printed, still warm from the machine at the pharmacy. James standing on stage under the lights holding his award, his name gleaming, applause frozen mid-motion behind him. She looked at both for a long moment, and then gently, reverently, she peeled the drawing from the fridge. She didn't crumple it. She didn't discard it. She placed it carefully into a small memory box tucked on a nearby shelf. Then she lifted the photo, centered it, pressed new tape at each corner, and let it settle onto the fridge door, the most honored wall in their house. No gold frame, no spotlight, just truth resting quietly where meals were made and coffee was poured. Because in their home, the fridge had always been more than a place for grocery lists and sticky notes. It was a place for proof of effort, of pride, of love made visible. And now James sat at the center of it. Not because Emily finally saw him, but because the world finally caught up. James stepped into the kitchen just as she was smoothing the last corner of tape. He looked at the photo, then at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said softly. "I know," she replied, voice catching slightly. "But I wanted to." He smiled, small, humble, grateful, and said nothing more. They sat together on the couch, cake between them, the television off, the windows cracked to let in the evening air. No need to speak. The quiet between them was full, because some honors aren't given at podiums. They're found in ordinary kitchens, on refrigerator doors, in the eyes of someone who finally gets to say, without hesitation, "That's my father." And in that still golden moment, Emily realized something she hadn't been able to name before. Heroism doesn't always come in uniforms or make headlines. Sometimes it wears thrifted suits, washes dishes without being asked, knows your favorite breakfast cereal, and stays day after day, year after year, without ever asking for applause. It doesn't need a crowd to matter. It just needs someone to notice. And that night, in the quiet hum of home, with laughter from a distant yard and the scent of sugar in the air, Emily looked at the man who had always been there and knew she had given him the only crown that ever really mattered. Not a medal, not a plaque, but a place finally at the heart of everything they had built together, their home. And in that home, the throne wasn't carved from gold. It was just a simple fridge door, but it held the weight of everything he was and everything he had been long before the world ever bothered to see it. Have you ever known someone like James? Someone who stood behind the scenes, carried the weight quietly, and loved not with loud declarations but with quiet consistency? If you have, maybe it's time to tell them. Not because they asked for recognition, but because sometimes even the strongest people need to hear, "I see you." If this story touched something in you, drop a comment below. Whether it's a memory, a person, or just a thought, you never know who else might need to hear it too. And if you believe more stories like this deserve to be told, don't forget to like this video. It helps others find their way to stories that matter. Subscribe to That Person Was Me for more true stories that reveal quiet heroism, restore your faith in people, and remind us all that dignity doesn't always shout, but it never goes unnoticed. And hey, before you go, take a moment today to thank the ones who stayed, the ones who showed up when it was hard, the ones who became family by choice, because sometimes the greatest heroes are already standing right beside us. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next story.